Good morning. I was asked to share the word today. And I wanted to talk about something that has been kind of on my mind and it's been close to my heart for the last few years, quite a few years now, which is based on, it's going to be divided in two parts. Today is part one. Of how to be truly changed by the gospel, based on the chapters 7 and 8 of Romans. And we often see people or hear of people around us where we see them, they come to Christ and some are really transformed and they just never look back. And you can see a true transformation in their lives. And others, of which I have been one of them, who kind of always tend to struggle, and we make some progress, but then we always end up almost in where we began, and back to square one. So I wanted to dig a little bit into this concept of what does the Bible actually say about being truly changed by the gospel. So I wanted to read a few verses from Romans chapter 7, verses 4 to 6, where Paul says, "So my dear brothers and sisters, this is the point. You died to the power of the law when you died with Christ. And now you are united with the one who was raised from the dead. As a result, we can produce a harvest of good deeds for God. When we were controlled by our old nature, sinful desires were at work within us, and the law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds, resulting in death. But now we have been released from the law, for we died to it and are no longer captive to its power. Now we can serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit." Then if we skip over to verse 18, which the first few times I've read it in the past feels like a bit of a tongue twister to read, which it says, "And I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. I want to do what is right, but I can't. I want to do what is good, but I don't. I don't want to do what is wrong, but I do it anyway. But if I do what I don't want to do, I am not really the one doing wrong. It is sin living in me that does it. I have discovered this principle of life, that when I want to do what is right, I inevitably do what is wrong. I love God's law with all my heart, but there is another power within me that is at war with my mind. This power makes me a slave to the sin that is still within me. Oh, what a miserable person I am. Who will free me from this life that is dominated by sin and death? Thank God, the answer is in Jesus Christ our Lord. So you see how it is. In my mind, I really want to obey God's law, but because of my sinful nature, I am a slave to sin." So based on this, on these verses, I wanted to break it down into three different points. Number one is what is our biggest problem as humans. Number two is what won't solve this problem, so a bit of a negative side of things. And number three, what will. So first of all, based on what we've just read, what is our biggest problem? What is Paul saying here that is our biggest problem? And the problem is in our flesh, in our sinful nature, and that in this flesh, in this sinful nature that is within me, there is really nothing good. We have in our mind the desire to do good, but we don't have the ability to perform these good acts. So the real problem is this evil, this sinful nature that lives within me. We were all born with it because of our fallen nature. But I think sometimes we don't truly acknowledge this, that there's really, in my human nature, in my human strength, there is nothing, I'm hopeless. There isn't the ability to do good within me. This is what Paul is saying. And if we don't truly understand this, and I think a lot of us fall into this kind of trap of maybe believing that I can, if I try harder, I can maybe make it. So our main enemy is our fallen nature, our flesh, what Paul calls our flesh. And if there's going to maybe reach a point in our life where if we didn't know this, or we thought that because we had a good upbringing, we come from a Christian family, maybe that's not so much the case. But there is going to reach a point in our life where we're going to be faced by difficult circumstances, either at home, at work, in your marriage, where something's going to come out from inside you and you're going to realize, where did this come from? This is not good. It may be a bad thought, a bad behavior, evil desires, so on and so forth. And when we are confronted by this, we say, this isn't good. I need to change this. I need to get on top of this behavior, of these thoughts, or whatever this is. So this leads me on to the second point, is what do we kind of automatically do when we are faced with these things? I think most of us, when we are confronted with this, we automatically go to the law, to the moral law, to the Ten Commandments, and we say, starting tomorrow, I'm going to be really good, I'm going to try really hard, I'm going to pray more, I'm going to read the Bible every day, I'm going to have my devotional, I'm going to confess my sins, so on and so forth. I certainly have done this many times where I think tomorrow I'm going to start to change and get on top of this. But I don't know about you, but whenever I've tried to do this, it may be a week, it may be a couple of weeks, it may be a couple of days, and I've already failed miserably at doing this. And it's exactly what Paul says here. He says, that what I want to do, I don't do. And that's what I don't want to do, I end up doing. And actually, if we think about it, pretty much, I think, I'm not an expert on this, but almost every religion on this earth kind of agrees on what good moral laws are. They're all, even including Christianity, have a pretty good grasp on this. Like, I don't know, be generous to the poor, always tell the truth, be faithful to your spouse, do good and love others. I think pretty much every one of them kind of agree on this. So we could think that historically humanity has had a pretty good idea of what good looks like, but we have failed as humans to do this actual good that we believe should be done and what is morally correct. So it seems quite evident that, as Paul is saying, when we are confronted with evil, we turn to our moral book and we look at what we should be doing. But in the passage that we just read, in verse 5 of chapter 7, Paul says something quite fascinating that I hadn't really paid that much attention to before. And it says, when we were controlled by our own nature, so by our flesh, sinful desires were at work within us, and the law aroused these evil desires that produced a harvest of sinful deeds resulting in death. So it says, and the law is the one that aroused these evil desires within me. And of course, he's not saying that the law is bad and the law is at fault for this sinful behavior, but it's pointing out there's something within me that's opposed to the law, that wants to do the opposite. And that's our sinful nature. So what he is saying is that if we turn to the law to try and follow God's law, if we do this to try and follow God's law, which in itself is perfect and is good, it might actually make things worse, because it means I end up doing the opposite. And what does this, how can this be? This was quite interesting to me, because how can it be true that when I try to do good and I try to follow God's law, it actually ends up making things worse? And I was listening to a sermon where he was talking about one of St. Augustine's confessions, where he talks about a time when he was a young boy, and he was with a group of young friends, and they were stealing pears. And the quote from his book is as follows. He says, "But the fruits were not desirable in and of themselves. My desire," Augustine accounts, "was to enjoy not what I sought by stealing, but merely the excitement of thieving and the doing of what was wrong. There was a pear tree near our vineyard, laden with fruit, though attractive in neither color nor taste. To shake the fruit off the tree and carry off the pears, I and a gang of naughty adolescents set off late at night. We carried off a huge load of pears, but they were not for our feasts, but merely to throw to the pigs." And so in his books, when he reflects on this later in his life, and he reflects on it in the light of, first of all, he didn't like the pears. It says they weren't attractive in any way, and he wasn't hungry either. So why on earth did he steal them? And he comes to the conclusion that it was because he was told that he shouldn't do it. So there was something in his heart that said, no one's going to tell me what to do, I'm going to go and do the opposite. So essentially, when he was presented with a law, his nature was to break it. And this is human nature. Another example is that I heard is of another teenager who woke up one day and looked around his room and said, "This is an absolute mess. I really need to tidy this up today." Went away, took a shower, and when he came back with the intention of cleaning up, his mum comes in and says, "Your room is an absolute mess. You really need to sort this out today." And immediately what he did after that, he just walked away and said, "I'm not doing it." And I think this probably may sound familiar to a few of us. I certainly have done this in the past, where I have a good intention, I want to do something, but when someone else comes and tells me that I need to do it because this is wrong, I almost want to do the opposite, which is, it's quite interesting. And Paul takes this even further. At the beginning of chapter 7, he says, "Well then, am I suggesting that the law of God is sinful? Of course not. In fact, it was the law that showed me my sin. I would never have known that coveting is wrong if the law had not said, 'You must not covet.' But sin used this command to arouse all kind of covetous desires within me. If there were no law, sin would not have that power. At one time, I lived without understanding the law, but when I learned the command not to covet, for instance, the power of sin came to life, and I died." And again, this is really interesting, because he's saying, while I wasn't aware of the law and I went about my life, sin didn't have this grasp on me, it didn't have this power. But once I knew that this was wrong, then sin took control of my life, and I died. And I think it's interesting that Paul talks about the last commandment. It's the 10th commandment, not you must not covet. Because if you read them, I read them the other day again, and it's the only one that deals with the motivations of our heart. All the other 9 are to do, they kind of address our behavior and say you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. But this is the one which deals with the motivations of our heart. And I guess when Paul looked inside himself and examined his heart, he was struck by this. So essentially, what I want to get at is, if we obey the law in order to say, I'm going to be, because I obey the law, I'm a better person. I have overcome my problems. God now blesses me because I've become a better person. People should respect me. First of all, this is making me self-righteous. It's thinking that I'm better because I have overcome my sinful nature. Second of all, it will make me anxious because I'm never quite sure if I'm good enough, if I'm making a big enough effort, if I've changed enough, have I done enough, which leads on to even more self-absorption and looking at myself. And thirdly, it leads to anger, in a sense, because whenever something goes wrong in my life, I'm going to think, this has certainly been true for me, I think, how can this be happening to me? I'm a good person, I've followed all the rules, I've done things the right way, I've made such a big effort to be a good person, and why are things suddenly going wrong for me, and compared to this other person that seems to not even be trying? It seems very unfair. So in essence, if anger comes from trying really hard, anxiety, self-righteousness, and so on and so forth from doing this, so in other words, it leads to being even more self-centered. And in theory, the law should be ridding me of self-centeredness, because that's the essence of sin. It actually seems to be making it worse. And in the New King James Study Bible, I found a bit of a historical quote where it was saying that ancient philosophers and Jewish thinkers argue that the knowledge of the truth, and specifically Jewish thinkers emphasized in the knowledge of the law, would subdue these passions. So in essence, they believe that if we know the truth and we understand the law, then these passions will be subdued. But Paul is saying, doesn't really share this optimism, because he says that we are trying to do what can't be done in our own strength. And it made me think that I think probably historically most, maybe, I don't know in terms of percentage, but I think most Christians tend to fall in this trap. And I think maybe this explains why when we speak to a non-Christian and we ask them what they think of, if they've met Christians, what they think of them, they usually don't have very good experiences, or they probably met maybe some that are good, but they usually have a bad experience with someone who's just bashed them over the head with the Bible and said you shouldn't do this and do that. Because it is this, if we believe that we are the ones that obey the law and makes us better, it makes us self-righteous, and it makes me think that I'm better than you because I'm doing all these things. So basically I'm my own personal savior. And we are trying to do what Paul says that we can't. I wanted to read something from a book from an American preacher from the 16th century called Jonathan Edwards, where he wrote a book called The Nature of Virtue. And in this book, he essentially says that we can do things in two ways. One, you can do something as a means to an end, or secondly, as an end in itself. So what do these, I looked up in a dictionary what these two things mean. And the first one to do something as a means to an end, it says, in the phrase means to an end, the word means is used in the sense of a method or instrument used to obtain a result. So basically I do something because I want something in return. And the second one is something that one does just because I want to, just because I like it, and not because I will achieve something in return for doing this. And basically in this book he says that there's two ways to obey the law of God. Number one is you're doing it for your own sake. You're doing it to get self-respect. You're doing it so that I can look at myself in the mirror every day. It's so that others may respect you. You're doing it so that God will favor me. You're doing it so that God may take me to heaven, so that He'll answer my prayers. So in other words, I'm obeying the law for my own sake. And the second approach is to do it for God's sake, just to please Him, just because He is good enough in Himself. So in the first one, I'm doing this to get things from God. And in the second one, I'm doing it because I want to get to God. I want to get God, which is very different. I want to please Him. I want to thank Him for what He has done in my life. And in this book, he calls the first one common morality, and the second one is called true virtue. So in common morality, what we're actually doing is using God and using your morality in order to get control of your life. I'm a pretty good person already by doing the things that I do, so God can't really do anything. He just has to favor me after that. And in true virtue, what he says is, I do it just for the joy of it, for the greatness of getting to know God, of spending time in His presence. And he said, unless we understand the gospel of sheer grace, unless your relationship with God is based on absolute grace, we're just doing things for our own sake and enhancing our self-centeredness and looking inside of us instead of we're not having, our heart isn't being truly changed. We're just guarding it and putting walls around it to protect it. We're essentially restraining it, but it's not really changing from the inside. And I found an illustration in one of Charles Spurgeon's sermons, which makes it quite easy to understand these two differences. And he says, he gives the story of a gardener who grew a wonderful carrot. And he took it to his king and said, "My lord, this is the greatest carrot I have ever grown or will ever grow. Therefore, I want to present it to you as a token of my love and respect for you." The king was touched and discerned the man's heart. So he thanked him. And as he starts to walk away, the king says, "Wait, you have clearly been a good steward of the earth and a good subject of mine. I have a plot of land right next to yours. I want to give it to you freely as a gift so you can garden it." The gardener was obviously amazed and rejoiced in this gift and walked away feeling very happy. But now there was a nobleman at the king's court who overheard this conversation and thought to himself, if this man got 5 acres of land just for a carrot, then I can only imagine what I could get in return if I can bring him a gift. So the next day the nobleman comes before the king with a handsome black stallion, and he said, "My lord, I breed horses, and this is the greatest horse I have ever bred or ever will breed. I want to give it to you as a token of my love and respect to you." The king immediately discerned his heart, so he just took it and dismissed the nobleman and said, "Thank you." The nobleman was perplexed. And as the king walked away with the horse, he called out and said, "Your Majesty, I don't understand." And the king turned around and said, "I know you don't understand." He says, "Listen, the gardener was giving me the carrot, but you were giving yourself the horse." And I thought this was a really good illustration to understand this in a simpler way. And so what he is saying here is, unless we understand the gospel of radical grace, of understanding that we are absolutely hopeless, that there really is nothing good within me, that I deserve death and that would have been just. But instead he sent his son to pay the price for you so that you would be saved. And now your obedience, our obedience to God, has to be completely framed by this truth. I want to please God because he is beautiful, because what he did in the cross was absolutely beautiful. Even though I'm never going to truly understand it, it's amazing, and this is why I want to please God. This is why I want to be a better person. And once we start to have this change of mindset, this is when our heart starts to really change. And I wanted to finish with the beginning of Romans chapter 8, which will be the subject of next talk, where I wanted to dig in a little bit deeper in that. It says in verses 1 to 4 from Romans chapter 8, it says, "So now there is no condemnation for those who belong to Christ Jesus. And because you belong to him, the power of the life-giving Spirit has freed you from the power of sin that leads you to death. The law of Moses was unable to save us because of the weakness of our sinful nature. So God did what the law could not do. He sent his own Son in a body like the bodies we sinners have, and in that body God declared an end to sin's control over us by giving his Son as a sacrifice for our sins." And in chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians verse 21, it also says, "For God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that he could be made right with God through Christ." So that we could be made right with God through Christ. So I just wanted to finish on this so that we can do this shift in our mindset and the way that we address change in our life, and that we can hopefully do it by focusing on God's grace and what he's done for me, and not in trying really hard, which is exhausting. As we see it, it's not effective, and at the end doesn't really change me. But through Jesus Christ, that is how we are really truly changed in our hearts. That's what I want to share.